I've been doing this a very long time. There is no aspect of this subject that I don't feel confident and comfortable to go head to head with anyone on. I was recently asked to debate Francesca Albanese, actually, and I said yes, absolutely. And she unfortunately declined. But studying international law, which I did in no small part because I recognised this was the arena in which Israel was being attacked. And it hasn't even started.
There's so much to learn from you in terms of how we explain Israel's case and Israel's cause to people in conversation. That's where I really want to be the theme from tonight. You know, in some ways, the tactics. How do we go about doing this? How do we make the case? But before we do that, I just wanted to get a little bit personal first, because many people will know a lot of the the key arguments when it comes to Israel and things I'm sure you will have stated. But not many people in this room will know about you personally and what it is that made you become such a passionate defender of Israel, an advocate. It takes a lot of guts to do that in the public sphere. I wonder if you could touch a bit on your own personal background, family background maybe, so we can understand a bit more about what brought you into this whole world.
Ollie, thank you, first of all, very, very much for the kind words. And I'm very honoured to be in a room like this. I'm quite glad that you've started with that question, because it is extremely meaningful to me and not a little bit emotional. I grew up thinking, not in a Jewish part of London, thinking that there were 3 other Zionists in the whole of the UK, my parents and my sister. It wasn't until I got to university, got to Oxford, that I realised that there were some others that thought the way I thought, that saw the world the way I saw the world, that realised that this wasn't just Israel's fight, even then, which is longer ago than I probably care to admit. But when I was at university, it was apparent to me that this was already a fight for Western civilization, and that we had to do everything within our power to strengthen Israel, to fight that fight also on behalf of the UK, the US, Europe, and liberal democracies everywhere. It's possible that if there'd been such a community that exists now with StandWithUs at university, that I might not have been quite so active. I don't know. I know that what drove me to educate myself as much as possible on Israel and to try and speak up at every opportunity, not just for Israel, but also for the proper application of law, for the rule of law, was the fact that unfortunately I found that no one else was really doing it at that stage. And when I got to secondary school, I went to a very nice school, Godolphin and Latimer, in Hammersmith, which gave me a tremendous amount, not least my passion for speaking up for the truth on this subject. Because when I got there, it was pretty apparent that the intellectual liberal elite received wisdom on Israel was pervasive. And I was, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, the only one, because that drove me really to immerse myself in this subject for some 25 years. And I feel so tremendously privileged. It's extremely humbling when people say thank you, Renee. I feel still here, not least because I've never felt that this was a choice. So when people thank me, it feels awkward. And I also feel that this is a tremendous privilege. For me, it has been 25 years of such a sense of purpose. And it's particularly encouraging that I am sensing that same sense of purpose pervading through the room and through everyone that I'm looking at out here.
You've done some really epic events and debates. You were alongside Douglas Murray debating Mehdi Hassan last year. Have had lots of viral moments, viral clips. I wonder, on this long journey now, what would you say is a sort of standout memory that's your proudest or maybe most memorable?
It might be the Oxford Union, not because I thought it was a particularly good evening for us, but because I had spent most of my student career trying to get a paper speech in that damn union, and I'd been thwarted at every opportunity. And so for the first time, I was invited back to speak at the Oxford Union, and it really did feel, in some senses, like a homecoming. But unfortunately, the audience wasn't thrilled to have us there.
And I'll just speak up. And speaking of people not being thrilled to have you in certain places, you just had a new achievement today, which is you got booted off an LBC discussion for giving your opinion.
That was bizarre.
Yeah. So for those, that deserves a round of applause probably. For those of you who haven't caught up yet, Natasha was asked to speak about something that's very topical at the moment, which is that Israel have decided to bar the entry of two Labour members of Parliament who decided they want to come to the country. I also covered this today on the channel. It turns out that these are two members of Parliament who are highly, highly critical of Israel.
That was very diplomatically put.
Well, this is the thing. I sort of feel that sometimes we're kind of lulled into this sense of it's legitimate somehow. That the opinions of deciding to describe what Israel's doing when it's showing such surgical precision in this existential fight against Hamas, describing it as genocide, calling for boycott of Israel as well. It's just a legitimate opinion. People boycotted South Africa under apartheid. These opinions of saying, well, I believe in the Palestinian right of return, which would really mean the dissolution of Israel. And so, many people are saying Israel should be able to express its sovereignty and say, do we really want to have two people who do have some authority to then come into the country and undermine our very existence? On the other hand, Ian Dale, who was the presenter at the time, who you seem to slightly rattle, was saying, well, how could we conceive of the notion that a fellow democracy would bar two elected officials from coming into the country? And he was obviously unhappy with your response, even though a lot of people afterwards on Twitter and social media seemed to think you were just expressing a very legitimate opinion. What's your view on what's gone down in the last 24 hours?
And in fact, this is very recent. I did this interview only upstairs before coming down to see you all. And I was very surprised because I went into the studio to do a cross question last year with Ian Dale, and I thought we got on rather well. So I was quite startled by the rejection of a perspective that didn't quite sit with his own, but also by the hypocrisy which is at play here, not just from Ian, I have to say, but from several ministers that we've heard from today, the Minister for the Middle East, Faulkner, the Foreign Secretary, Lamy. This is I can see he's popular here. The one who couldn't quite row back his claim that Israel had broken international law and said that he could have perhaps been clearer. I mean, breaking international law and not breaking international law is pretty binary. I'm not sure how anyone could lack clarity on that, but there we are. So Lamy and Faulkner and Ian Dale are taking the position that this was an unacceptable decision by Israeli immigration authorities. That's not one that I accept for a number of reasons. One aspect that seems to have been lost from the equation here is that these two members of parliament were asked the purpose of their visit as they came to the border in Israel, and they told the Israeli immigration officials that they were there for a parliamentary delegation. Now, that was not true. They were not attending Israel for a parliamentary delegation. They were on a delegation, they say, according to their statement, that was being organised by CABU, the Council for British Arab Understanding, and which was also being facilitated by Medical Aid for Palestinians. Now, you might be aware of Medical Aid for Palestinians because they only stopped funding the Healthworks Committee, which was linked to the PFLP, which is in part a prescribed organisation here in the UK. They only stopped funding that terror-linked entity after a complaint by UK Lawyers for Israel to the Charities Commission. So just think about the two entities that were involved in organising this so-called parliamentary delegation, which was not to Israel, which was to the West Bank. So they give that information to the immigration authorities. They check. There is no record of these members of parliament attending a delegation from parliament in Israel because it didn't exist. So they, I can see from the reporting of it, were essentially guilty of providing inaccurate information to immigration officials, which in the usual course would put you straight back on the plane. I think normally at your own cost, but the State of Israel actually paid for their plane tickets back. Put that to one side And then you come to Israel's law. Now, since 2017, there has been an amendment to the entry law in Israel so that there is black and white, clear letter law to refuse entry to individuals who are actively involved in promoting a boycott of the country. Why? Not unlike our legislation here that prevents the entry of individuals who are considered not conducive to the public good. I can't think of anything less conducive to the public good in Israel than members of parliament that actively slander the Jewish state. You just need to look at their Twitter feeds, and that essentially call for Israel to be boycotted, but also promote blood libels against the Jewish state, in particular in relation to the conduct of the war in Gaza. So on every level, this is a rank hypocrisy when we consider, in fact, Kemi Badenoch referred to two prominent politicians that the UK had denied entry on that very basis, not conducive to the public good. One was Moshe Feiglin, an Israeli, and the other was Geert Wilders. So it beggars belief, but it is consistent with this pattern, I'm afraid, and we heard it from our students here, the nature of the anti-Israel tirade is not one that follows reason, is not one that follows precedent or fact. It is hysterical, and it is really unfortunate that that interview essentially descended into something that I can only really describe as hysterical.
We just need to clone Natasha 1,000 times, and I think we'll be all right.
I do have a little sister.
Who's great, by the way.
In fact, she made a series of phenomenal videos with you, Ollie, on JTV. What was it, nearly 10 years ago now?
Yeah. One of them was about the four maps. And, you often see on campuses, they show these four maps of how Palestinian land, quote unquote, has been slowly, disintegrating over time. And it kind of unpacks the truth and falsehoods of that. Well, that exactly leads me on to the next question I want to ask you, which is really the theme of this evening and Stand With Us, what they're doing and their campaign, which is about the importance of educating people around Israel's history and modern Jewish history. And that being such an essential tool in being able to articulate Israel's case. Why is it so important that people can get clued up on, not just what's happening now and looking at things in a very isolated way, but knowing the full story of the history? Why is that such an important part of the equation?
And unfortunately, because of the times in which we're living, I was just last week at the anti-Semitism or Countering Anti-Semitism conference in Jerusalem, that unfortunately quite a few people from the UK dropped out of, including the chief rabbi. And there were some very interesting discussions happening that were seeking to unpack, to better understand the kind of phenomenon that we are dealing with. And one aspect of this, which I'd not really encountered before, but I think really hits the nail on the head, was referred to as erasive anti-Semitism. It's something that the Louis Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law in the US have written on, and it is about erasing Jewish identity as it pertains to the religion, as it pertains to the race, the nationality, the peoplehood, and the connection with the land, and enforcing an identity on the Jews that is purely religious. Jews are a religion, and the erasive anti-Semitism is at the core of denying Jewish indigeneity to Judea. It is at the core of rewriting history, and it has found extremely fertile ground because of this linkage with, progressive camps, with the notions of anti-colonialism. You mentioned South Africa earlier, and in fact this was a perfectly good example, I think, of drawing a comparison, right? The campaign against South Africa talked about real apartheid. There was a legitimate issue that was being combated. The counter of what we're dealing with this with respect to Israel is a falsehood that is being propagated, and a similar framework of what was established with South Africa is seeking, these people are then seeking to apply it on the basis of that falsehood. And we're seeing the inversion of all of these buzzwords that you will all be very familiar with: occupation, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid, genocide. It's linked to erasive anti-Semitism because they are only able to take hold if you get rid of Jewish identity and Jewish history. But it's even more insidious than that, because in each of these respects, what is happening is these phrases, these terms, are becoming inverted, and the real victims of these practices are being accused of committing them. In a sense, you may also have heard of the projection aspect of anti-Semitism. Tell me what you're guilty of. It's what you accuse the Jews of. Occupation. Jews were subject to occupation, not just under the mandate by the British, but also throughout millennia, even the Ottoman Empire previously. There's a good argument for that. Colonialism. Israel is the decolonization success story after the end of the British mandate, the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people by those indigenous to the land. Apartheid? Well, I can tell you where the real apartheid is, because I was just in the West Bank on the week before last, and I drove past big red signs that warned any Israeli not to go into Area A on pain of committing a criminal offence. Now, they don't actually mean any Israeli. That's the thing. Everybody knows what they really refer to is Israeli Jews, because Arab Israelis go back and forth into Area A, which is entirely controlled by the Palestinian Autonomy, the PA, the Palestinian Authority. So Jews are not permitted there by law under the PA. That area has been ethnically cleansed of Jews, and that's where the real ethnic cleansing exists too. Likewise, when Jordan occupied Judea and Samaria and East Jerusalem. And then we come on to this concept of genocide. And it is the latest iteration of the inversion of the crimes that were committed against Jews. I don't just mean the crimes in the Holocaust, but also those committed on the 7th of October, those acts of genocide that targeted Jews because they were Jews. So in that context, it is so important that we don't only have the background, the knowledge, the real history to push back on, and you're doing this far better than I ever could, but the real battleground for that, of course, is on social media. I've just sort of semi-joined. It's not me technically, but there is now a Natasha Hausdorff account on Instagram and on Twitter or X. So at least if some of the interviews are being put out in that kind of forum, I'm trying to emulate some of your incredible work, Ollie. But it's so important in that context that we arm ourselves, but also, and this is where I think Stand With Us is critical, providing confidence to push back on these issues. Because it's one thing knowing that you're right, it's another having the fact so much at your fingertips that you feel empowered to take on these falsehoods head on. And I have felt extremely lucky to have not just the sort of background of growing up, going to Israel, recognising the reality of the situation and therefore deciding to read and arm myself with as much of the facts as possible, but also studying international law, which I did in no small part because I recognised this was the arena in which Israel was being attacked. And it hasn't even started. I mean, you think everything that's going on at the ICJ and the ICC, it may have reached its pinnacle. I'm afraid that this is just the beginning of the process, this use of lawfare and abuse of international law. Mahmoud Abbas made it very clear already in 2012 that this was part of a clear planned agenda. In that respect, it's not just enough educating yourself on the history and the politics and these developments every single day and the falsehoods that the newspapers print, but I'm afraid also I would like to encourage you all to become mini experts on international law, because what is being said is untrue. And the moment that you start to be able to properly unpick that, it's an incredibly powerful feeling, and I would that you all experience it.
One of the things that I find you're so brilliant at is, it's one thing to have the confidence to go out and debate. It's another thing to have the knowledge. But there's a third thing, which I think is what you just excel at so much, which is knowing which bit of knowledge, which piece of information to utilize in a debate when responding to an argument, especially when you only have 30 seconds on a news interview or 2 minutes in a debate. And you're often so able to just puncture the argument with a brilliant rebuttal. Do you have any tips for us on how to know which piece of knowledge to pick out, or which, what tactic we should use when we have a very limited amount of time to respond to, one of the many accusations leveled at Israel?
I really didn't expect so many difficult questions this evening. You're very, very good at picking up the ones that are tricky to answer. It happens somewhat instinctively, I'll be frank. And I think it just comes from practice. I've been doing this a very long time. There is no aspect of this subject that I don't feel confident and comfortable to go head to head with anyone on. I was recently asked to debate Francesca Albanese, actually, and I said yes, absolutely. And she unfortunately declined, but I'd say, if it's in any way helpful, the news cycle seems to be constantly changing. Suddenly there's another allegation. Yesterday it was Israel attacking ambulances. I've just seen a review of the footage that the New York Times put out that shows armed men just before the Israeli forces are said to open fire, although this report also indicated that the automatic fire you hear is from Hamas, not from the IDF. In one sense, that story is developing all the time, but in another sense, it's always the same story. Israel is attacking children. Well, no, it isn't. Either that's Hamas shooting them, or unfortunately they've been caught up because they're being used as human shields by Hamas. Israel is attacking ambulance workers. Well, actually, the majority of those that Israel was able to identify of the casualties on that particular incident were also found to have links to Hamas. Israel's ethnically cleansing the Palestinians. Well, they've, been refused the ability to leave Gaza. That's actually a real breach of international law. Egypt's responsibilities under international law, under the African Union Convention on Refugees, the notion that Egypt would completely seal its border, or that Palestinians uniquely are going to be prevented from leaving a war zone if they seek to flee. Each of these new developments may look unusual, but ultimately it's always coming back to the same falsehoods and the same blood libel. So I hope that that's a little bit of a helpful kind of trick, if you will. You hear something that you think is completely outlandish and new, and you think, how on earth could I possibly answer that? Well, the chances are you've probably dealt with it before in some slightly different form, because these lies only have so many manifestations that they can be put forth in. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's really interesting. In a moment, I want to take it out to the audience for questions. So start to have a think about questions you'd like to ask Natasha. We've got a bit of time to do that. But I also would encourage you to please, they always say this and it never happens, but please do try to make it a question. But Natasha, lastly, very difficult at Jewish events. Natasha, lastly, my last question to you is, you just said before that what we're seeing with the legal, the lawfare attacks on Israel with the ICC and the ICJ, you were saying that's just the tip of the iceberg. What do you envisage is like the bigger plan when it comes to weaponizing international law against Israel?
We're already starting to see aspects of this, but it's one thing if claims are being made in the ICJ or the ICC or the UN Human Rights Council. It's another if individual courts in domestic jurisdictions are being utilised, are being weaponised for that process. We're already seeing that to a certain extent. There were reports today of this dossier that's been given to the Metropolitan Police. I mean, none of what's been published about it is in any way new. These are the same false allegations that have been levied against Israel, not just from the start of this war. I was surprised. I listened back recently to an interview that I did in 2014 during Sukkot Tam. And my counterpart, it was a 40-minute sort of debate in the studio in LBC 10 years ago. My counterpart was accusing Israel of genocide then. None of this is new. So I think that is, it's not necessarily you're going to see a completely different manifestation of what we're witnessing, but it's going to be far more concentrated, it's going to be even better funded. And I think the question as to where the funding for this comes from is one that needs to be answered urgently. Qatar's fingerprints are on a lot of this, but not all of it. We're going to see these sorts of mechanisms to harass Israelis and Jews deployed more and more in domestic jurisdictions. And, you know, if people have been watching the news today, to the extent that outlets have been covering it, I've seen that not everyone was prepared to, because it's a bit of a non-story, this dossier that Michael Mansfield is headed up. To the extent that there are more and more of these coming through, I'm afraid ultimately it's going to be a tiring process to deal with them if they are taken seriously by the authorities. So I think that's probably going to be the next stage.
So you don't see Qatar as this good, benign actor that Steve Witkoff set?
In a word, no.
Okay, right, questions from the audience. To watch Natasha answer audience questions, click the link in the video description. It will take you to JTV Plus, where a whole new range of premium content awaits.